Hi, my name is Kristen. This is Kristen Craves Books. This is the first time I'm filming in over a week because I sometimes forget that I am allergic to red dye 40, and I was exposed to it and had hives on my face for a week. I'm just now at the point where I feel like I can put on makeup and feel comfortable without having to like slather lotions on my face 24/7. So here we are, and I have just been dying to do this video because I am the co-host of Team Gin for the Once Upon a Readathon that is happening in June, and I'm going to do a whole separate video with my TBR with some recommendations of books with gin, because this whole thing has made me realize that anytime I read a book that has gin in it, I love it. So I'm really excited for June. But one of the ways to get extra points is to read a book that has a water setting. So that could be set by the lake, on the sea. It's really up to interpretation. So like an island setting, I have quite a few island settings in the books that I'm going to recommend today. And even if you are not participating in the readathon, I love water settings, especially in the summertime. So hopefully you will find something to add to your TBR. The first book I'm going to talk about is probably not one that would come to mind right away, but it's the first thing that popped into my head because I love it that much. And this is Pure Nessie by Susanna Clarke. This is not a water setting in the traditional sense because there's actually an ocean inside of this home. We're following Pure Nessie and his journal entries, and this is a short book, so it's good for a readathon, though I think there's a lot to unpack in this one, so it's not one that you can read through quickly, but it's worth it. And as I said, this house is like a whole universe, and this is Pure Nessie's entire life, and he knows the tides of the ocean, and it's just, there's like a whole ecosystem inside of this house, this mansion, and it's so epic and cool and unique, and I was surprised by where this went. I just think that this is so brilliantly written, so atmospheric, and definitely water setting. There's an ocean inside of the house. It is so cool. So if you want something different, this is one to pick up. And then one that I know I own, but I can't seem to find my copy of, is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. And I often think that is a comp for Pure Nessie. They're not the same, but I think the vibe is similar. And The Ocean at the End of the Lane, it leans more towards horror. So if you're a horror reader, this is one we're trying. It was my first experience with Neil Gaiman and I loved it. So all you really need to know is that we're following a middle-aged man who is returning back to his home for the first time, his childhood home. And he's sitting by this pond reflecting on this experience that he had with a young girl, and she believed that this pond was an entire ocean. And that sounds kind of whimsical, and in some ways it is, but this is horror. It gets dark and sinister and really goes there, and you just have to be along for the journey. And if you've read Neil Gaiman, you know the writing to expect. Highly recommend the audio for that one, but that's a good pairing with Pure Nessie. So if you liked either of those, try the other one, because I think they're for a similar kind of reader. So you might be tired of me recommending this book, and I do not care, because it fits into every recommendation video I do. It is just that good and has that many layers, and that is The Lighthouse Witches by CJ Cook, who is one of my favorite authors. So underrated. You need to read everything CJ Cook has ever written, but start with The Lighthouse Witches because I truly think it's her most accessible, and it's set by water. Look at this cover. There's a lighthouse, blue foiled waves in the background. It is perfect. This is set on a remote Scottish island. Part of it's historical fiction. It is told in two timelines, and in the storyline set in the past, we're following a single mother who has been commissioned to this island to paint a mural on the lighthouse, and she brings along her two daughters. One of them goes missing, and then the other timeline is following the surviving daughter who gets a phone call that her sister has been found, and she is the same age she was when she went missing. So there's a lot to unpack there. There's a grimoire in here, there's witches obviously, and we get a lot of the myths and lore of how the witches on this Scottish island were treated, and it's just a fantastic one. I need to reread this fall. Maybe I'll reread it in June. I don't have time, but I'm tempted to because it is that good. So if you like witchy stories, if you like historical fiction, if you like a little bit of gothic horror, because that's what I would call this, if you like Scottish islands, I know a lot of us love that, you have to try this. And it's just, as I said, there's so much to unpack here, so many layers. I can put it into any recommendation video, no matter what it is, because there's just so much going on and I love every stinking second of it. Okay, I'm out of breath from pitching that book to you, but I think the nature of Greek myth retellings makes them so they kind of fit into this. Like a lot of them are set by the water because like the Odyssey's traveling on the water. So any retellings of those stories, the whole Trojan War takes place by the water. So they all kind of work. I'd be remiss not to mention Circe by Madeline Miller. Madeline Miller is the perfect place to start with Greek myth retellings. This is my favorite of hers, but A Song for Achilles also fits this prompt and is also fantastic. But Cersei is banished by her family to this island, and the island is almost a character in of itself. You see her make a home there, all of the creatures that live there as well. There are pigs on this island. Then we also see like adventures on the sea as well. I don't want to give too much away. There's a whole scene that takes place underwater. So water plays a huge role. This island plays a huge role. Cersei is one of my favorite characters of all time. I just love her. But a lot of Greek myths will work for this. 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes I also really like. What else do I have? Like The Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker. A lot of that stuff will work. Let me grab something. I know that a lot of us like to read shorter books during readathons, so I think Medusa by Jessie Burton is a good one, and it's a Greek myth retelling, obviously, about Medusa. Now, I don't know that the story was my favorite, but if you're not that familiar with Medusa and her story, I think this is a good place to start. And it is set by the water. I want to show you some of the illustrations in here. Like, these illustrations are just stunning, and I think Medusa as a character is really interesting. So if you're looking for something quick, and by quick I mean really quick, like look how it is written. You can get through this in a couple hours, and it is a good introduction to Medusa. So that's another one I didn't plan on recommending, but I feel like it is worth giving a try. This one is like a classic at this point. Everybody's heard about this, but I just want to put it on your radar in case you forgot it existed. And this is Life of Pi by Yann Martel. This is one of the few books I've read over 2 times. Like if I reread something, I only reread it once, but I've read this 4 or 5 times. The first time I read it, when it was really popular, when it first came out, I didn't get it. I think I was too young. It would just all went over my head. Then I decided to reread it a few years later, and I got it, and I loved it. And this is just following a young boy who is lost at sea. He's part of a shipwreck, and it's just him and this tiger trying to survive on a lifeboat. And I know that sounds strange, but the reason the tiger there all makes sense. It has one of the best endings I have ever read. So it's really, you see him survive the elements, being out in the sea with little food and no water, while also trying to survive this tiger and form kind of a bond with this tiger. And it is just so beautifully done. And I loved every second. And then you can watch the movie. I've actually never seen the movie, but if you read this, you can watch the movie afterwards. And obviously a water setting. Now this is a bit of a different recommendation. This is like a thriller mystery with a bit of fantasy in it, and this is The Change by Kirsten Miller. This follows 3 women with 3 very different personalities who are not friends at the beginning of the story, but when they reach menopause, they all get these different powers and they become friends, and they stumble upon the body of a dead girl on a remote beach in their community. They live in an oceanfront community in Long Island, so the water plays a huge part of this. That's where they find the body, in the water, and the police aren't really doing anything, and they are determined to find the killers, and they use the powers that they have gained to do so. And there are scenes that are set in a boat in the ocean, and it's really a commentary on the uber wealthy and what they can get away with, and just the power that women have. And I like that we followed women who are middle-aged. They are epic characters. Like, I would say that this is a character-driven mystery, and I loved it. I thought it was brilliant. So it's a perfect summertime read, perfect for this readathon if you're looking for something like this. Then I have one that I don't talk about, but I think this is more of a Canadian novel. I don't know that this became popular anywhere else, but this is The Boat People by Sharon Bala. This is set in 2010, and it talks about a true event that happened in Canada at that time that I was not aware of, and I don't think a lot of Canadians were. So this really highlights that, and this is set in Vancouver, and it's following 3 different perspectives after a refugee ship ends up on the shores of Vancouver from Sri Lanka. So we get the perspectives of how these refugees are treated from people who are all connected to that in very different ways. And it was eye-opening for me as a Canadian. Can't believe I hadn't heard of this story before. And while the water isn't a huge part of it, it really starts from the water. The beginning of it all stems from this ship landing on the shores of Vancouver and unravels from there, and I just think it's a worthy read, one that I should probably talk about more. And then I want to talk about a few that I don't own. The River by Peter Hellier is one that I rated 3 stars at the time, but it's been a few years and I still think about that book. I remember every detail, so I think I liked it more than I thought, and I need to reread it. But if you like thrillers that are more man versus nature than man versus man, I would check this one out. It follows 2 best friends who decide to go on a canoe trip in northern Canada on a river, and just their fight for survival. It gets wild and there's a lot that goes down in this, and my heart was racing, and it's so tense. And there's also a sequel to this. I think it's called The Guide, that I haven't read yet, but if you love the river, The Guide is sitting there for you as well, and I believe that is also set near the water. So yeah, this is a really unique thriller, and I think a lot of people would really enjoy it. And then I'd be remiss not to mention Into the Drowning Deep and its prequel, Rolling in the Deep by Mira Grant. Finally read these, love them. The whole entire thing is set in the water, in Marianas Trench. We're following this crew who is trying to figure out the events that happened in the prequel, and there may be killer mermaids involved, and it is a true mix of horror and thriller. There's a lot of tension. There's sci-fi as well. Like, some of the sci-fi elements went over my head, but it was worth it. And I just thought that this was incredible. Really tense. It's a longer book, but it reads so quickly. And if you are interested in reading Into the Drowning Deep, there is a buddy read happening for the Readathon in the Discord. So I will link to that down below. There's a lot of people reading that. I will be joining in the chat because I will take any excuse I can to talk about Into the Drowning Deep. It's like just kind of fun, and I loved it, and we need more books with killer mermaids. I love that. Then I have a random historical fiction that I read years ago and still think about and is a favorite, but I never talk about, and this is The Exile by Christina Baker Klein. And this is following 3 women who are detained in London and put on a convict ship sent to Australia. And we are just following, the first half is following these 3 women trying to survive being at sea. Between all the elements at sea and the men on board as well, there's a lot that they go through. And then the second half is them trying to make a life for themselves in Australia, and the effect that just their arrival has on the community in general. And then, yeah, it's shocking. It's shocking, but it's fantastic. And I think it's worth knowing going in that one of the women is pregnant when she is detained. So if that would be troubling for you, know that going into this one. Let's move on to the adult romances that I have. I probably could come up with more than the 4 that I have here, but they are the 4 that came to mind. I love romances set near the water. The first one is It Happened One Summer by Tessa Bailey. Of course, the only Tessa Bailey that I have truly loved. Didn't love the sequel, and I wouldn't recommend it, but some people liked it, so who knows. But I would recommend It Happened One Summer. This is following a girl who is based on the character Alexis from Schitt's Creek, so you know the type. And she ends up being arrested in the first chapter, and her stepfather sends her to the town where her father, who has passed away, grew up and lived. And he thinks that this will give her some perspective and keep her away from the media and all that stuff. And she obviously is not thrilled about this, but she goes and she meets the love interest, Brandon, and they do not get along. He's more brooding. They are very, very different, but they have so much chemistry, and they are so sweet. And the town that she is sent to is a fishing town. It's a fishing community, and it's really a big part of the story. The love interest is a fisherman, so we see him go off to sea and the stress that that puts her under and how much she misses him. And I just loved those moments, and the whole community coming together, because the fishing community and the fishing industry is such a big part of what keeps this community going. So like, the community part of this book is so essential to why I loved it so much, and probably why I didn't love the sequel as much, because I didn't feel like we got the community. It really could have been set anywhere, that one, so it didn't feel as much of a water setting book as the first one. But if you're gonna read one Tessa Bailey, please make It Happen One Summer. Then I have a couple messy books for you. So if you don't like messy romances, skip this part. But if you do like a messy romance once in a while, Every Summer After by Carly Fortune. This was huge last year. I understand why some people would hate this, but I had such a good time with it. And part of that is that this is a Canadian author. This book is set in Ontario, which is where I live. It's by Barry's End, like a cottage community. The summers in Ontario, I'm so relate to. It's so nostalgic for me. Our main character is from Toronto, and she spent her summers growing up at this cottage. And the love interest, who lived next door, lived at the cottage full time. And we see them grow up as teenagers and go from friends to lovers. And then we also have a timeline where they're in their 30s and they no longer talk. So it's slowly revealed what happened back then and why they no longer communicate, and it's a mess. These are not perfect characters, but just all the scenes of them like laying on the dock, swimming in the lake, I just loved it so much. And this author actually has a new book called Meet Me at the Lake that is set in the Muskokas, which is very close to me, and I've spent some time there as well. So I'm excited to read that one. I'll be reading that one in June, but that seems to be her thing, that she writes these romances set on lakes in Ontario, and I'm here for it. Now, speaking of messy, You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty by Quickie and Messy. One of my favorite romances ever. It is a mess. I can't tell you how. I was shocked by it. You have to go in and just accept that you won't like every decision that our main character makes, but you might come to understand them. And our main character, Faye, is grieving the loss of her husband. She is a widow in her 20s, and this opening scene of this is a sex scene. And she is just trying to get over the loss of her husband. She doesn't want to form connections with anybody romantically, but then she ends up meeting somebody, and he invites her to her family's house on this tropical island in the Caribbean that is like an unnamed island, but it's very tropical, and I think that's obviously why I chose this as a water setting. And everything goes down on this tropical island. And that is all I will say about this one, except that her best friend Joy is one of my favorite characters ever. And yeah, the setting is great. It's a mess. You have to try it. And then if you don't love messy romances, I understand you. I got you. This is Sweet Hand by N.G. Peltier, and it is one of the cutest romances I've ever read. If you couldn't tell by this cover, look at this cat. This cat's name is Jello, and there's a piece of cake on here. So I had a calico cat. She was like the love of my life, and I love cake and baking and romances, so this was made for me. And this is set in Trinidad. So we are following these two characters who hate each other, but their best friends are getting married. So she is the maid of honor and he's the best man, and they're forced together a lot because of wedding festivities, and Dutch is the nature of weddings, and of course a romance blooms, and I loved it. And because it's set in Trinidad, there's a lot of water, and it's very tropical, and it's great. And there is a sequel to this that I haven't read yet, but that looks more water setting, and I can't believe I haven't read this. It's called Don't Go Baking My Heart. It has everything that I love in a romance, so I have to get to that one. Maybe I'll do that in June as well. My poor TBR. But yes, highly recommend Sweet Hand. I'm gonna finish this video by recommending some YA novels set by water that are my favorites. I love YA during readathons because you can just get through them more quickly, and they are fun, and I have some really good ones here. This first one I know is not going to be hit for everyone. It's for a very specific kind of reader, but if we tend to have similar reading tastes in like weird sci-fi, you might like this. This is The Ones We're Meant to Find by Joan He. This cover though is stunning, and I just really like this. This is like sci-fi and kind of dystopian, and we're following two sisters who are separated. One lives in this community that's built above the water, and those are where the only human survivors are because of like climate change, and the earth is not safe to live on anymore, and she is searching for her sister who happens to be stranded on a remote island. So lots of water in this one. I love books following sisters, especially if they're separated like this. Their writing was really beautiful. Didn't go where I thought it was going to go at all. You're either gonna love or hate the twist in this one, but it kind of blew my mind, and it honestly is just a beautiful book to look at. And then one of my favorite books of last year, it's set on a remote island. The water's not huge in this story, but you know it's an island. They make you know it's an island, so to me it counts. And that is This Vicious Grace by Emily Thede. This is so underrated, so you just have to try it. The back says, 3 weddings, 3 funerals, 1 more chance to save them all. This is a bodyguard romance. Our main character has the responsibility to save everybody in her community from these demons that are coming and threatening to kill them all. But in order to do this, she has to harness power from another person, and the way the traditions go, she has to marry this person, then harness their powers, and it makes her that much stronger. But she's done this many times now, and each time the person ends up dying on her because she's just too strong or they can't handle it. And we're at this point where people start to believe that maybe she's not the chosen one, that she is not the right person to save them, and a bit of a rebellion is happening. And we see her hire this bodyguard to protect herself. And there's some great found family as well, because there are different people who are vying to be the next person that she marries, because it's kind of an honor, even though they're terrified, and they slowly start to like her. So there's that as well. And then the romance with the bodyguard, and I loved it, and you have to try it. Everybody that I forced this on seems to like it, so I trust this recommendation. And the sequel comes out in December, so now is the time, and it is an island, it counts. This one you don't have to question at all. This is The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea by Exile. Water everywhere, water dragon on the side. Love this book. It is so whimsical. It's following a main character who, she lives in this village where every year a maiden has to be sacrificed to the sea god to appease the sea god. And in this particular year, it happens to be her sister-in-law, but she chooses to sacrifice herself because she knows that her brother couldn't handle this. And so that doesn't sound very whimsical to start with, but once she meets the sea god, once she's where she has to be, it is really dreamy and whimsical, and I love the writing, and it's on the shorter side, and it really just feels like a fairy tale. And I loved it. I thought it was really, really beautiful. And then I know a lot of people like to read graphic novels during readathons, so I have a perfect one, The Girl from the Sea by Molly Knox Ostertag. And the artwork in here is really cute. You can get through this in under an hour. It's set in Nova Scotia, which is fun. And it's just the romance between this young girl and this character who happens to be a Selkie. And it's bittersweet in a lot of ways. We also get to see her friendships, and yeah, it's just, I loved it. Her family as well, and a lot about this community in Nova Scotia. And I didn't know much about Selkies until I read this, so it had me Googling about Selkies in general, so I thought that was really interesting. So if you know of any other books that follow Selkies, can you give me recommendations down below, because I'm kind of fascinated by them now. Then we have a book from one of my favorite YA authors, that is Anna Marie Michelmore. This is their only book set by water that I can remember, and this is Lake Lore. And this is kind of reminds me of Pure Nessie in the way that it's kind of strange, and it's following these two characters who meet 7 years ago, and they are the only two people that are able to access this entire world beneath the lake, and then they don't see each other for many years, come back together and start a bit of a romance, but this lake is following them around, like in their homes and stuff. So it's magical realism in the way that Anna Marie Michelmore writes magical realism, but they're also dealing with the struggles of being teenagers, struggling with their identities, struggling being Mexican immigrants. All these kind of things are on their plate as well, while also focusing on falling in love for the first time, and then the strange stuff with the lake. So I just thought that this was beautiful, as is everything that Anna Marie Michelmore writes, but you have to give this one a try, and this cover is kind of cool. I'm trying to get through this quick. I have so many recommendations. This one's an obvious one, but I had to mention it. Salt to the Sea by Marissa Petty. It took me years to read this because I thought that it was so hyped. I couldn't love it as much as everybody said that I would, and then I did because it's fantastic. This is set during World War II, which I know is an oversaturated genre in historical fiction, but this one takes a unique look at it, and we're following 4 teenagers who are just on a journey to aboard a refugee ship, and we see them just fight to make it there and to get a spot on the ship. And we see thousands of other people trying to do the same, and it's harrowing and heartbreaking and moving and sad, and I cried and I loved it. This next one you might not expect on a list like this, but I think it counts. This is The Firekeeper's Daughter by Angeline Boulley. This is set in Sioux, Michigan, which is by the water, so it counts. I live near there, and I know, and they mention in this book that she takes the bridge over to the Canadian side quite a bit. The bridge is over water. To me, this counts, and I just want to recommend it because I love it. And Angeline Boulley has a new book out called Warrior Girl on Earth that I really, really want to try, and I think it would count too because I think it's set in the same area. So we're following Donis, who is a member of the Ojibwe, and she, through a series of circumstances that I thought going into this would be convoluted, but when you read it, it makes so much sense. She ends up working with the FBI to uncover who is bringing drugs into the reservation. It's really heartbreaking, but so well done. So it's a mystery as well. There are some twists. I was shocked in some moments, and I loved Angeline Boulley's writing as well, and to me this counts. It's a water setting. And then I'm just gonna go through a few that I don't own that are YA. Hold Back the Tide by Melinda Salisbury is a horror book set near the water, takes place by cliffs a lot. It's a young girl trying to fight off monsters that are coming into her town. That's all you need to know. I was shocked by how much I love that one. It's so tense. I think this is a perfect introduction to horror if you want to get into the genre. It is so good. Then we'll end this video with a really fun one that I think is underrated. It's a YA contemporary called Where the Rhythm Takes You by Sarah Doss, and she has a new book that's either out or coming out soon that I want to read. But this is set in Trinidad at a resort. Her family owns a resort and they're struggling, and she has like a friends to lovers, kind of enemies to lovers romance with somebody that she grew up with who left Trinidad and became like a famous superstar and has come home with his friends, and she ends up having to be a tour guide for them, and they reconnect and try and save the resort and stuff, and it's just really good. so underrated. I loved the writing in this, and it's so tropical, so summery. Loved every second of it. So those are my recommendations. I hope you found something to add to your TBR. Let me know if you've read any of these. Let me know what you would recommend for this. I noticed there's not a lot of like straight up fantasy on my list. I tried to read The Adventures of Mina al-Sarafi and Softy and F That. I want to try again in June because it's just so perfect for the readathon. But if you know any fantasy books set near water or on the sea, please let me know because I just need help with my TBR. I'm overwhelmed as it is, but I could use some fantasy set by the sea or in the water. So let me know that. Thank you again for your support. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.